Don't sign it. The words came out small, almost lost beneath the low hum of air conditioning and the soft shuffle of tailored suits. But the moment they left her lips, something in the room shifted, like a glass surface catching a crack no one could yet see. William Ashford's pen hovered just above the final line of a $42 million agreement, the ink tip trembling a fraction of an inch from sealing what his board had already called a historic expansion into the Asian market. Around him, the conference room gleamed with polished walnut, floor-to-ceiling windows stretching across a Manhattan skyline washed in late afternoon light. Everything precise, controlled, predictable, until a small hand wrapped around his wrist. He turned, slowly, not out of alarm, but disbelief, his gaze falling to the girl beside him, no taller than his elbow, her dark eyes fixed not on him, but across the table. Zoe Carter stood there in a faded denim jacket 2 sizes too big, a thin backpack strap slipping off one shoulder, her braids neatly tied, but slightly frayed at the ends, as if she had done them herself in a mirror that didn't quite reach her height. She didn't look like she belonged in a room where decisions moved markets and men measured silence in millions, and yet her grip didn't loosen. That's not what he said, she added, her voice steadier now, cutting just enough through the quiet to draw every eye toward her. A few executives exchanged quick glances, polite smiles tightening at the edges, the kind reserved for unexpected interruptions that needed to disappear quickly. Victor Liang, seated across the table in a charcoal suit that fit like it had been engineered rather than tailored, tilted his head with a courteous expression, though something flickered behind his eyes too fast to name. "I'm sorry," he said smoothly, his English precise, measured. "Is there a problem?" The translator beside him adjusted his glasses, ready to repeat the same sentence again if needed, but William didn't answer right away. Instead, he studied the girl, the way her fingers pressed lightly into his sleeve, not desperate, not frantic, but deliberate, as if she had already decided something long before this moment. "Zoe," he said quietly, remembering the name his assistant had mentioned earlier that morning, something about a scholarship candidate waiting in the lobby. "This isn't the time." A faint ripple of restrained laughter moved through the far end of the table, quickly swallowed by professionalism, but Zoe didn't look at them. She looked at Victor. "He said you won't control the company," she said, each word careful, deliberate. But in Mandarin, he said the opposite. The room didn't react all at once. It held its breath. The translator blinked. Victor's smile remained, but no longer reached his eyes. Somewhere near the windows, a legal analyst shifted in his chair, pen pausing mid-note. William's hand, still caught beneath hers, slowly lowered from the page. Outside, a helicopter traced a distant line across the skyline, silent through the glass, as if even the city had stepped back to listen. "You understand Mandarin?" William asked, not sharply, but with a curiosity that edged into something deeper. Zoe nodded once. "Enough," she said. Then, softer, almost like a confession meant only for him. "Enough to know they're not telling you the truth." And just like that, the balance in the room began to tilt, not with noise, not with argument, but with a quiet, undeniable question that no one at the table could ignore anymore. The silence did not break with laughter this time. It tightened, stretched thin across the length of the table like a wire pulled too far, and William Ashford felt it in the way every person in the room suddenly stopped moving, as if even the smallest gesture might tip something over that none of them yet understood. Victor Liang's smile returned, smoother now, practiced, the kind that had closed deals in cities William had never even visited, and he leaned forward just slightly, folding his hands together with a calm that seemed almost rehearsed. "I believe there is a misunderstanding," Victor said, his tone even, respectful, the translator beside him already preparing to echo the words. But William raised a hand before the repetition could begin. "Wait," he said quietly, not looking away from Zoe. The girl had not moved, not an inch, her fingers still resting against his sleeve, though now they were lighter, no longer stopping him, only anchoring him, as if she understood that the decision was his to make, not hers. Around the table, a few executives shifted in their chairs, discomfort creeping in through small movements, a pen tapping once against polished wood, a throat clearing too loudly in a room that had gone too quiet. "Zoe," William said, lowering his voice, not to silence her, but to understand her. "Tell me exactly what you heard." For a brief second, doubt flickered across her face, not fear, not hesitation, but the weight of being the only voice moving against the current, and then it was gone. "He said the terms are balanced," she replied, nodding slightly toward Victor. "But in Mandarin, he said once the deal is signed, control shifts quietly, not immediately, but slowly, through clauses that look normal if you only read the English version." A murmur rippled at the far end of the table, softer this time, less dismissive, more uncertain, and the legal analyst by the window straightened in his seat, his eyes narrowing as he glanced down at the contract in front of him. Victor let out a small breath that almost sounded like a laugh, shaking his head gently. "Children can be very imaginative," he said, his voice still calm, still measured, but now there was a subtle edge beneath it, something firmer, more controlled. Perhaps she overheard fragments and misunderstood the context. The translator nodded quickly, repeating the statement with the same polished confidence, and for a moment, the room seemed ready to settle back into its original shape, to let the interruption dissolve into something harmless and forgettable. But William did not pick up his pen. Instead, he leaned back slightly in his chair, studying Victor with a new kind of attention, one that was no longer focused on numbers or projections, but on the space between words. "Then let us make it simple," William said, his tone still calm, but now carrying a quiet authority that shifted the air again. "Repeat what you just said to your colleague in Mandarin." The request landed gently, but it did not feel light. Victor's eyes flickered just once before the smile returned, thinner now, more precise. "Of course," he replied, turning slightly toward his associate, and as he began to speak, the language flowed smoothly, rapid and fluid, filling the room with sounds that most of the table could not follow. But Zoe did not look at him. She looked at William. And when Victor finished, when the translator opened his mouth to deliver the expected version, she spoke first. "That is not what he said," she said, her voice quiet, but unmistakably steady. And this time, no one laughed at all. The room did not move, but something inside it shifted with a quiet certainty that no one could deny. And William felt in the way the air no longer belonged to Victor Liang or the polished certainty of the deal, but to a single, steady voice that refused to bend. Zoe did not raise her tone. She did not step forward. She simply held her place beside him and continued. "He said once the agreement is signed, your company will appear to retain control for 12 months. But during that time, operational authority will transfer through secondary clauses tied to performance benchmarks that they define, not you." The translator froze, his mouth slightly open, the words he had prepared dissolving before they could take shape, and across the table, Victor's expression remained composed, but the stillness in his shoulders betrayed something deeper, something measured and recalculated. A chair shifted near the far end of the table, louder than it should have been, and the legal analyst by the window leaned forward now, flipping through the contract pages with a sharper focus, his pen moving quickly as if chasing something that had just come into view. "That is incorrect," Victor said, his voice firmer now, though still wrapped in courtesy. "The structure is standard for international partnerships, nothing more." But this time, the room did not accept the answer as easily. William did not respond immediately. Instead, he reached forward and slowly turned the contract toward himself, his eyes scanning lines he had already reviewed twice that morning. Except now he was not reading for clarity, he was reading for intention. "Show me," he said quietly, not to Victor, but to Zoe. The request landed differently than the one before, not a test, not a dismissal, but an invitation. Zoe hesitated for only a fraction of a second before stepping closer, her small hand moving carefully across the page until her finger rested beside a paragraph buried deep within the document, a section that most would have skimmed past in favor of the headline numbers. "Here," she said, her voice softer now, but no less certain. This part talks about adaptive oversight, but in Mandarin, he said it is a control mechanism, not a support function. The analyst's pen stopped. He looked up, then back down, his brow tightening as he read. The clause again, slower this time, tracing each word as if it might rearrange itself under closer inspection. Adaptive oversight, he repeated under his breath, then glanced toward William. That could be interpreted differently depending on how the performance triggers are written. A faint tension rippled through the executives, not loud, not chaotic, but undeniable, like the first sign of a storm that had not yet reached the horizon. Victor's smile returned, but it was thinner now, less effortless. Interpretation is always part of business, he said, leaning back slightly. That is why we rely on mutual trust. The word trust lingered in the air longer than it should have, and for the first time since the meeting began, William allowed himself to look directly at Victor, not as a partner, not as a negotiator, but as a variable he had not fully accounted for. Trust, William repeated, almost to himself, then shifted his gaze back to Zoe, who had not moved her hand from the page. What else? He asked. Zoe swallowed just once, and then answered, They are not lying about everything, she said carefully, just the parts that matter most. The room went still again, but this time it was not uncertainty that filled it. It was recognition. The word recognition did not arrive with noise or reaction. It settled into the room slowly, like a truth that had always been there, but had only just been seen, and William Ashford felt it anchor somewhere deeper than logic, somewhere that did not rely on numbers or projections, but on instinct sharpened over years of knowing when something did not align. He straightened slightly in his chair, no longer leaning back, no longer observing from a distance. And when he spoke again, his voice carried a clarity that shifted the balance entirely. We are going to pause this signing, he said, not loudly, not dramatically, but with a finality that made the words feel heavier than any raised voice could have achieved. A subtle ripple moved through the executives, this time not restrained, not masked, but real, chairs adjusting, eyes lifting, the quiet choreography of a room recalibrating itself around a new center. Victor Liang's expression remained composed, but the pause before his response was just long enough to register. Mr. Ashford, he began carefully. Delays at this stage could complicate timing on both sides. William did not look at him immediately. Instead, he reached for the contract once more, flipping back to the clause Zoe had indicated, his finger tracing the lines as if confirming something he had already decided. Timing is not my concern, William replied, his tone even controlled. Clarity is. Across the table, the legal analyst cleared his throat, more confidently now, his earlier hesitation replaced by professional focus. If I may, he said, glancing between William and the document, there are multiple interpretations embedded in these clauses, especially tied to performance triggers and operational oversight. It would be reasonable to request a full bilingual review before execution. The word reasonable landed with quiet authority, and for the first time, it felt like the room had shifted from persuasion to verification. Victor inclined his head slightly, still composed, still careful. Of course, he said, though the smoothness of his voice no longer erased the tension beneath it. We support transparency. Zoe stepped back half a step then, her hand leaving the page, but she did not move away entirely. She remained beside William, not as an interruption anymore, but as a presence that had altered the direction of the moment. William finally turned his head toward her again, his gaze softer now, not questioning, not testing, but acknowledging. You said they are not lying about everything, he said quietly, repeating her word with a precision that suggested he had not let a single syllable pass unnoticed. Zoe nodded once. They are telling enough truth to make the rest sound safe, she answered, her voice calm, almost reflective now, as if she had stepped beyond the fear of being wrong and into the certainty of being heard. A faint exhale escaped someone near the far end of the table. Not relief, not frustration, but something in between, the sound of a room recognizing that the conversation had moved beyond control. William leaned back again, but this time it was not distance, it was decision. He placed the pen down on the table, deliberately, the soft click against the wood echoing more than it should have in the quiet. "We will reconvene after a full independent translation and legal audit," he said, his eyes now meeting Victor's directly, steady, unyielding. "Until then, nothing is signed." Victor held his gaze for a moment longer than necessary, then gave a small, measured nod. "As you wish," he replied, though the ease from earlier had not returned. Outside, the city continued its motion, traffic threading through avenues, sunlight shifting across glass towers, unaware that inside a single room, a decision had just been undone, not by strategy, not by negotiation, but by a voice that refused to be ignored. And as the meeting began to dissolve in a quiet movement, papers gathered, chairs sliding back, conversations restarting in low tones, William did not reach for his phone or his assistant. He remained where he was, looking at the page Zoe had pointed to, then at her, as if recalculating not just the deal, but everything that had almost slipped past him unnoticed. The room did not empty all at once. It unraveled in layers, voices returning in low, careful tones, chairs sliding back with softened restraint, the kind of movement that follows a disruption no one had prepared for. And yet William Ashford remained seated, unmoving, his attention still anchored to the document in front of him, as if the ink itself might shift if he looked away too soon. Zoe stood beside him, quieter now, her shoulders slightly lowered, but her eyes still alert, still tracking the space as though she had not yet decided it was safe to let the moment go. "Why did you say something?" William asked finally, his voice low enough that it did not carry beyond the edge of the table. Not a challenge. Not even a question meant to test, but something closer to curiosity that had not existed an hour earlier. Zoe hesitated, her fingers brushing lightly against the strap of her backpack, a small, grounding motion before she answered. "Because you were about to trust something that was not honest," she said, her tone simple, without accusation, as if the statement did not need decoration to be true. William leaned back slightly, considering that, his gaze shifting briefly toward the far end of the room, where Victor Leong was now speaking quietly with his associate, their voices too low to distinguish, but their posture more contained than before. "People bring me deals every day," William said, almost to himself. "They all say the same thing, that it is balanced, that it is fair." Zoe nodded, not in agreement, but in understanding. "And sometimes it is," she replied, "but sometimes they say what sounds right instead of what is real." The distinction lingered between them, subtle but sharp, and William exhaled slowly, the kind of breath that marked a recalibration rather than a reaction. Across the room, the legal analyst approached, holding a marked copy of the contract, his earlier uncertainty replaced by a focused urgency. "Mr. Ashford," he said, lowering his voice as he reached the table. "I reviewed the section she indicated, and there are inconsistencies between the English phrasing and what we would expect from a direct translation structure. It is not definitive yet, but it is enough to justify a full forensic review." William nodded once, taking the document without looking away from Zoe for long. "Proceed with that immediately," he said, then after a brief pause, added, "and bring in an independent Mandarin legal specialist, not one connected to this deal." The analyst nodded and moved off quickly, already dialing his phone, and the momentum in the room shifted again, no longer centered on negotiation, but on verification, on uncovering what had been layered beneath polished language. Zoe watched him go, then glanced back at William, her expression softer now, almost uncertain, as if the moment that had required her certainty had passed and left behind something quieter, more human. "I did not mean to interrupt," she said after a moment, her voice lower, less steady than before. "I just did not want you to sign something you could not undo." William looked at her then, fully this time, not as a variable in a situation, not as an unexpected voice in a controlled environment, but as someone who had stepped into a space that was never meant for her and changed it anyway. "You did not interrupt," he said, his tone firm but not harsh. "You corrected something I missed." The words settled between them, simple, but carrying more weight than the deal that had just been paused. And for a moment, the noise of the room faded again, not into silence, but into something quieter, more deliberate. Near the windows, Victor Leon glanced back toward them, his expression unreadable from a distance, but no longer entirely confident, and William followed that glance for only a second before returning his attention to Zoe. "Where did you learn Mandarin?" he asked, the question gentle, but precise, as if the answer might explain more than just language. Zoe shifted her weight slightly, her gaze dropping for the first time, not out of fear, but memory. "From my grandmother," she said, her voice softening in a way it had not before. She used to say that understanding someone's words is not the same as understanding what they mean. William absorbed that in silence, the sentence echoing against everything that had just unfolded, and as the last of the executives filed out of the room, leaving behind the faint scent of coffee and polished wood, the scale of what had almost happened settled fully into place, not as a mistake avoided, but as a truth revealed by the one person no one had expected to be listening. By the time the last executive stepped out and the glass doors eased shut behind them, the room no longer felt like a battlefield of quiet negotiations. It felt like a place that had been interrupted mid-thought and was now trying to remember what it had been before everything shifted, and William Ashford remained seated for a moment longer than necessary, his hand resting lightly on the contract, not to claim it, but to hold it in place, as if it might still try to move without his permission. Zoe stood a few feet away now, no longer beside his chair, her backpack strap pulled back up on her shoulder, her posture smaller again, as though the space had returned to its original scale and she had to adjust herself to fit back into it. "You were not supposed to be in that room," William said quietly, not as a reprimand, but as an observation that carried more curiosity than judgment. Zoe nodded, her gaze drifting briefly toward the door, then back to him. "I know," she admitted. "I was waiting outside, but the door was open and I heard them talking." William followed her glance, picturing the hallway, the quiet outside the glass, the way voices could slip through when no one thought they needed to be careful. "You understood everything they said?" he asked. Zoe shook her head slightly. "Not everything," she answered, honest without hesitation, "but enough to know it did not match what they were telling you." The precision of that answer settled into him more deeply than any full translation could have, because it was not about language, it was about awareness, about noticing the gap between what is said and what is meant. William stood then, slowly, the movement deliberate, not rushed, and as he did, the scale between them shifted again, not into imbalance, but into alignment, because when he turned toward her, he lowered his voice, not to diminish her, but to meet her where she was. "Come with me," he said. Zoe hesitated for a fraction of a second, then followed, her steps quiet against the polished floor as they moved out of the conference room and into the hallway, where the air felt cooler, less charged, but not entirely calm. Assistants moved in the distance, phones ringing softly, the rhythm of the building continuing as if nothing had changed, even though something clearly had. William led her to a smaller office just off the main corridor, a space with softer lighting and fewer windows, where the city was only a reflection rather than a presence, and he closed the door gently behind them, not to isolate, but to create space for clarity. "Tell me exactly what you heard from the beginning," he said, his tone steady, focused, the same voice he used in boardrooms, but now directed toward understanding rather than control. Zoe took a breath, her hands tightening briefly around the straps of her backpack before she let them fall. "They were talking before the meeting started," she said, her words slower now, more careful, as if she were replaying the sounds in her mind. "One of them said the English version would make it look balanced, but the real structure was hidden in how the clauses connect later." William's jaw tightened slightly, not in anger, but in recognition of a pattern he had seen before, deals built on layers that only revealed themselves when it was too late to step back. "And you're sure about that?" he asked. Zoe met his eyes directly, not defensive, not uncertain, just steady. "Yes," she said simply, because they repeated it twice, like they wanted to be sure the other person understood. The detail landed with weight, not because of what it said, but because of how it was said, the intention behind repetition, behind clarity that was never meant for him. William turned slightly, looking toward the reflection of the hallway in the glass panel beside the door, seeing movement without focusing on it, his mind already shifting into a different kind of calculation, one that did not rely on projections, but on trust, not blind trust, but earned, tested, and in this moment, unexpectedly placed in the hands of a girl who had nothing to gain from being right. "All right," he said after a pause, turning back to her, his voice quieter now, but more certain than before. "Then we're going to make sure we understand everything." Zoe nodded once, and for the first time since she had stepped into the room she was never meant to enter, she allowed her shoulders to relax, just slightly, not because the situation was over, but because someone was finally listening all the way through. The quiet in the smaller office did not feel empty. It felt focused, like the moment before something important was finally put into place, and William Ashford stood near the desk, one hand resting lightly against its edge as he watched Zoe with a level of attention he rarely gave anyone without years of earned trust. Outside the glass panel, the hallway moved in soft patterns, assistants passing, voices low, the world continuing without knowing that something fundamental had shifted just a few steps away. When they spoke before the meeting, William said, his tone measured, deliberate. Did they mention anything about timing, about when control would actually change? Zoe closed her eyes for a brief second, not to avoid the question, but to replay it, as if the sounds were stored somewhere precise and needed to be retrieved carefully. "Yes," she said, opening them again, her voice steady. "They said it would not happen right away, that it would look normal at first, but after about 12 months, the conditions would activate, and then everything would start to shift without needing your approval again." William absorbed that in silence, the timeline aligning too closely with the clause she had pointed out earlier, the one that had seemed harmless until it was not. He straightened slightly, the decision forming not as a reaction, but as a structure, something he could act on with clarity. "All right," he said, moving toward the desk and pressing a button on the intercom. "I need Daniel Reeves in here now, and I want the independent Mandarin specialist on video as soon as possible." A soft acknowledgement came through, and the line clicked off, leaving the room in that same focused quiet. Zoe shifted her weight slightly, her gaze drifting toward the window, where the reflection of the city blurred against the glass, her posture no longer tense, but not entirely relaxed either. "Are they going to be in trouble?" she asked after a moment, her voice softer now, carrying a different kind of concern, not about being right, but about what came next. William looked at her, considering the question carefully. "That depends on what is proven," he said, not avoiding the truth, but not rushing to define it either. "Right now, we are making sure we understand everything clearly." Zoe nodded, accepting that, though her eyes still held a quiet awareness that understanding often led to consequences. A knock came at the door, followed by Daniel Reeves stepping inside, his expression alert, already aware that the situation had shifted. "You asked for me," Daniel said, glancing briefly at Zoe, then back to William, his tone professional but edged with curiosity. William handed him the marked contract. "I want a full clause analysis, every section tied to operational control and performance triggers," he said, his voice firm. "And I want it cross-referenced with a direct Mandarin interpretation, not the one provided in this room." Daniel nodded immediately, flipping through the pages with practiced speed. "We have already flagged some inconsistencies," he said, "but if what she is saying is accurate, this goes deeper than translation. It becomes structural." The word structural settled into the room with weight, and William gave a slight nod. "Exactly," he said, then glanced towards Zoe. "And she's going to stay while we review this." Daniel's eyes flickered with surprise, not resistance, just recalibration, and then he nodded again, adjusting his stance to include her in the space rather than exclude her from it. "Understood," he said. Moments later, a screen on the wall lit up, connecting to a remote call, the face of a Mandarin legal specialist appearing, composed, attentive, ready to engage. The room shifted once more, not into tension, but into precision, every word about to be examined, every meaning about to be tested. And as William took his place beside the table, he did not feel the weight of the deal that had almost been signed. He felt the clarity of the moment that had stopped it, and the quiet certainty that the smallest voice in the room had been the one that saw the truth first. The screen flickered once before stabilizing. The face of the Mandarin legal specialist coming into sharp focus. His expression calm, analytical, the kind of presence that did not rush to conclusions but did not miss details either. And as the connection settled, the room seemed to narrow its attention entirely toward him, as if every word that followed would carry weight far beyond translation. "Good afternoon," he said evenly, his voice clear through the speakers. "I understand there are concerns regarding discrepancies between the English contract and the spoken Mandarin." William nodded once, stepping slightly closer to the screen, his posture aligned, deliberate. "That is correct," he replied, then gestured toward Daniel, who immediately placed the marked document beneath the camera feed, highlighting the section Zoe had identified. "We need a precise interpretation," William added, "not just of the wording, but of the intent." The specialist inclined his head slightly, acknowledging the request, and began to read, his eyes moving steadily across the page, his silence stretching just long enough to build tension without breaking it. Zoe stood a few steps behind William, her gaze fixed on the screen, not anxious, not uncertain, but deeply focused, as if she were listening not only for confirmation, but for clarity she already sensed was coming. The specialist finally spoke, his tone measured, exact. "The English phrasing suggests a cooperative oversight structure," he said. "However, when aligned with the Mandarin expressions used in negotiation, this clause implies conditional authority transfer, not support. The language is intentionally flexible, allowing control to shift based on internal metrics defined by the external party." Daniel's pen stopped mid-note. The room did not react loudly, but the shift was undeniable, a quiet tightening of understanding that made the truth feel heavier than any accusation. William did not interrupt. He let the explanation continue. "Additionally," the specialist added, scrolling slightly through the document, "there is a pattern of layered phrasing. Individually, each clause appears standard, but when combined, they form a mechanism that gradually limits your decision-making authority over time. This is not uncommon in aggressive acquisition strategies, but it is not transparent." The word transparent settled into the air with precision, and William's jaw tightened slightly, not out of surprise, but confirmation, the kind that replaced uncertainty with certainty in a single, irreversible step. Zoe exhaled softly, almost imperceptibly, not in relief, but in recognition that what she had heard was now visible too. Everyone else. Daniel leaned forward, his voice quieter now, but sharper. "So to be clear," he said, looking toward the screen, "this structure would allow them to assume operational control without a direct ownership transfer?" The specialist nodded once. "Correct," he replied. "It is control through condition, not declaration." A silence followed, not empty, but full, as if every person in the room was recalibrating their understanding of what had almost happened. William finally spoke, his voice calm, but carrying a depth that had not been there at the beginning of the day. In the spoken Mandarin used during negotiation, he asked, would it reinforce this interpretation? The specialist did not hesitate. "Yes," he said, "based on what has been described, the spoken language aligns with the concealed structure, not the presented one." The confirmation landed with finality, and for a moment, no one moved, not because they did not know what to do, but because the weight of knowing had to settle first. William turned slightly then, his gaze shifting from the screen to Zoe, who stood quietly, her hands resting at her sides, no longer needing to prove anything, no longer needing to speak. "Thank you," he said to the specialist, his voice steady, then reached forward and ended the call, the screen fading back to black, leaving behind a reflection of the room that felt different now, sharper, clearer. Daniel closed the contract slowly, the sound soft but deliberate. "We were about to hand over control without realizing it," he said, not as a question, but as a statement that no longer required confirmation. William nodded once, his eyes still on Zoe. Not anymore, he replied, and in that quiet moment, the shift was complete, not just in the deal, but in who had the clarity to see it. The confirmation did not echo. It settled, quiet and final, like a door closing softly but completely, and William Ashford stood still for a moment, his gaze resting on the darkened screen where the specialist had just been, as if the reflection might still hold the weight of what had been revealed. The room felt different now, not tense, not uncertain, but sharpened, every object, every sound, every breath carrying a clarity that had not existed before. Daniel shifted slightly beside the table, his fingers tapping once against the closed contract before he looked up at William. "We need to contain this immediately," he said, his voice controlled but urgent beneath the surface. "If they realize we have identified the structure, they may try to reframe or withdraw before we secure the documentation." William nodded once, the decision already forming before the words had finished. "They will not have that chance," he replied, his tone calm but firm, the kind that did not invite negotiation. He turned toward the door, pressing the intercom again. "Hold Mr. Liang and his team in the building," he said, his voice even. "Tell them we are preparing revised terms and need a brief follow-up discussion." A pause, then acknowledgement. The line clicked off. Zoe watched him quietly, her expression thoughtful, not surprised by his response, but aware that the situation had shifted into something larger than what she had first stepped into. "They're going to try to explain it," she said softly, not as a warning, but as an observation. William glanced at her, a faint trace of something almost like a smile touching the corner of his expression, not amusement, but recognition. "Of course they are," he said. "That is what people do when the truth becomes visible." Daniel moved quickly now, gathering documents, marking pages, his earlier uncertainty replaced by precise action. "I will have legal prepare a formal review statement," he said, already reaching for his phone, "and we should document the discrepancies in both languages before any further discussion." William nodded again, then turned back to Zoe, his attention narrowing once more, not to the deal, not to the risk, but to the person who had shifted both. "Stay with me," he said, not as an order, but as a request that carried weight. Zoe hesitated only briefly before nodding, her small frame steady despite everything that had unfolded. Outside the office, the hallway seemed quieter than before, as if the building itself had adjusted to the change in momentum. And as William opened the door, the air felt cooler, sharper, filled with purpose rather than routine. They walked together toward the larger conference room, Daniel a step ahead, already coordinating, already aligning the next phase, while Zoe remained just behind William's shoulder, not leading, not following, but present in a way that no one in that building could have anticipated. When they reached the glass doors, William paused for a fraction of a second, not out of hesitation, but in tension, his reflection meeting his own eyes briefly before he stepped inside. Victor Liang stood near the far side of the room, speaking quietly with his associate, but he turned as soon as the doors opened, his expression composed, though now more measured than before. "Mr. Ashford," he said, offering a polite nod, "I trust your review is proceeding well." William walked forward at an even pace, each step deliberate, his presence filling the space, not with force, but with certainty. "It is," he replied, his voice calm, controlled, but carrying a new edge of clarity that had not been there earlier, "and it has raised several important questions." Victor inclined his head slightly, his hands folding together, his posture precise. "Then let us address them," he said smoothly. For a moment, the room held still again, but this time it was not uncertainty that filled it. It was alignment, the quiet understanding that the conversation about to take place would not be guided by assumptions, but by truth that had already been uncovered. William stopped at the table, resting his hand lightly against its surface, his gaze steady on Victor, and just behind him, Zoe stood quietly, her presence no longer unexpected, no longer out of place, but essential, as if the balance of the room had quietly, permanently shifted around her. The air inside the conference room felt different this time, not polished and performative, but measured, like every word that was about to be spoken had already been weighed before it was allowed to exist. And William Ashford stood at the head of the table with a stillness that did not come from hesitation, but from control fully reclaimed. Victor Liang remained composed across from him, his posture unchanged, his hands loosely folded, though the ease that had once defined his presence had thinned into something more deliberate, more cautious. "You mentioned questions," Victor said smoothly, his tone even. "I am confident we can clarify any concerns." William did not sit. He let the silence stretch just long enough to shift the center of the room before he spoke. "You said the agreement maintains balanced operational control," he began, his voice calm, precise. "But that is not what was communicated in Mandarin prior to this meeting." The words did not rise, but they landed with weight, and for a brief moment, no one moved. Victor's expression remained controlled, but his eyes sharpened slightly, recalculating. "There may have been nuances in phrasing," he replied. "Language differences often create subtle variations in interpretation." William nodded once, acknowledging the statement without accepting it. "Then let us remove interpretation," he said. And without raising his voice, he continued in clear, measured Mandarin, each syllable deliberate, unmistakable. "Repeat exactly what you told your associate before the meeting, including the part about conditional authority transfer." The room froze, not because of volume, but because of the shift, the unexpected reversal of language, of control, of who understood what. Victor's composure held for a fraction of a second, then tightened, his shoulders settling into a more rigid alignment as he realized the space had changed in a way that could not be redirected. Behind William, Zoe stood quietly, her presence still, her eyes steady, not surprised, not reactive, but aware, as if she had always known this moment would come. Victor responded in Mandarin, his tone measured, careful, but slower now, each word chosen with greater caution, and when he finished, the silence that followed was not empty, it was waiting. William did not translate immediately. Instead, he looked directly at Victor, holding the space long enough for the weight of the language to settle across the room. Then he spoke, returning to English, his voice calm, but carrying a clarity that left no room for doubt. "You said the English version ensures comfort," he translated, "but the structure ensures eventual control and that the transition will occur through performance conditions that we will not define." A quiet shift moved through the executives who had been called back into the room, their expressions tightening, their understanding catching up in real time. Daniel stepped slightly forward, his voice firm now. "That directly contradicts the presented contract language," he said, not as a question, but as a formal recognition. Victor exhaled slowly, his composure still intact, but no longer effortless. "This is standard strategic structuring," he replied, his tone more direct now, not deception, but alignment of long-term interests. William tilted his head slightly, considering that, then shook it once calmly. "Alignment requires clarity," he said, "not concealment." The word lingered, precise, undeniable. Victor did not respond immediately this time. For the first time since the meeting began, the balance of the room no longer leaned toward persuasion. It stood firmly in exposure. William rested his hand lightly on the table again, his posture steady, grounded. "We are terminating this negotiation," he said, not forcefully, not emotionally, but with a certainty that did not require emphasis, effective immediately. The silence that followed was complete, not uncertain, not fragile, but final. And as Victor absorbed the statement, his expression shifting just slightly, the reality of the moment settled into place, not as conflict, but as conclusion. Behind William, Zoe remained still, her presence quiet, but now unmistakably central, as if the truth she had carried into the room had fully reshaped everything around it. The silence that followed William Ashford's decision did not feel like an ending. It felt like a line drawn with precision, one that could not be crossed again. And for a moment, no one in the room moved, as if the weight of what had just been spoken needed time to settle into something real. Victor Liang stood still across the table, his expression composed, but no longer effortless. The subtle confidence that had once guided his presence now replaced with a careful neutrality that did not quite conceal the shift beneath it. "That is a significant decision," Victor said after a moment, his tone controlled, measured. "I would advise reconsideration before closing a door that could benefit both parties." William did not respond immediately. He allowed the words to exist in the space without reacting to them, then slowly shook his head once, not dismissively, but with clarity. "A door built on incomplete truth is not a door worth keeping open," he replied, his voice steady, grounded, not raised, not sharpened, but final in a way that did not invite further negotiation. Around the table, the executives who had returned for the follow-up meeting exchanged brief glances, their earlier uncertainty replaced by alignment, the kind that comes when clarity removes the need for debate. Daniel Reeves stepped forward slightly, placing the marked contract on the table with quiet precision. "We will be documenting the discrepancies between the presented agreement and the underlying structure," he said, his tone formal now, professional, "and our legal team will retain a full record of both the written and spoken representations made during this process." Victor inclined his head slightly, acknowledging the statement without contesting it, though the pause before his response suggested calculation rather than agreement. "We operate within acceptable strategic frameworks," he said. "Nothing here falls outside the norms of international business." William looked at him steadily, not confrontational, not aggressive, but unwavering. "Norms do not replace transparency," he said, the words simple, but carrying a weight that did not need emphasis. The room held that statement quietly, no one interrupting, no one attempting to redirect, because the direction had already been set. Victor's associate gathered a few documents from the table, his movements precise, contained, as if careful not to disturb the stillness that had settled over the space. "Then we will respect your position," Victor said finally, his tone returning to something smoother, though now more restrained, and withdraw from further discussion. William gave a slight nod, acknowledging the conclusion without extending it. "Thank you," he said, not out of courtesy alone, but because the moment no longer required anything more. One by one, Victor and his team turned and moved toward the glass doors, their departure quiet, measured, without disruption, but the absence they left behind felt larger than their presence had been, as if the room itself had been cleared of something it had not fully recognized until it was gone. When the doors closed, the reflection of the city returned to the glass, uninterrupted, steady, and the tension that had filled the room earlier did not return with them. Daniel exhaled slowly, his posture relaxing just slightly for the first time since the review had begun. "We were closer than we realized," he said, his voice low, not shaken, but aware. William nodded once, his gaze shifting briefly to the contract, then away from it entirely. "Not anymore," he replied, the words echoing the certainty that had replaced doubt. Behind him, Zoe stood quietly, her presence unchanged, but the space around her had transformed, no longer out of place, no longer unexpected, but integral to what had just occurred. William turned toward her then, his expression softer, not because the situation had ended, but because something else had begun. "You understood something that no one else in this room did," he said, his voice quieter now, more personal, "and you chose to speak anyway." Zoe met his gaze, her shoulders steady, her voice calm. "It mattered," she said simply. The answer did not need more than that. It mattered, and because it mattered, everything had changed. The room did not rush back to normal after Victor Liang and his team left. It lingered in a kind of quiet clarity, as if everyone present understood that something more than a business decision had just taken place, and William Ashford remained standing at the head of the table, his hand resting lightly against the polished surface, not out of habit, but as if grounding himself in a moment that had shifted more than he had expected. Daniel gathered the last of the documents, his movements efficient, but no longer tense, and after a brief glance toward William, he gave a small nod before stepping out, leaving the room to settle into a quieter, more personal space. The glass doors closed softly behind him, And for the first time since the meeting began, there were no voices layered beneath the silence, no competing intentions, only the steady presence of two people standing in a room that had almost changed everything. William exhaled slowly, the kind of breath that marked not exhaustion, but realization, and when he turned towards Zoe, his expression had softened in a way that did not belong to boardrooms or negotiations, but as something more human, more honest. "You did not hesitate," he said quietly, not as a question, but as an observation that still carried a sense of wonder. Zoe shifted her weight slightly, her fingers brushing against the strap of her backpack again, the small gesture returning now that the intensity had passed. "I almost did," she admitted, her voice softer than before, "but my grandma used to say that if you understand something important and stay quiet, then you become part of the problem." The words settled into the space between them, simple, but carrying a depth that felt far larger than her age, and William nodded slowly, absorbing not just what she had done, but why she had done it. He walked a few steps closer, not towering, not imposing, but lowering himself slightly as he spoke, meeting her at eye level without making it obvious. "Your grandmother taught you well," he said, his tone sincere, without formality, without distance. Zoe gave a small nod, her gaze dropping for a moment, not out of discomfort, but memory. "She used to teach languages," she said, her voice quiet. "She said words are like doors, but meaning is what decides where they lead." William allowed a faint smile to form, not out of amusement, but recognition, because in that moment, the complexity of contracts and negotiations felt simpler when placed next to a truth that direct. He glanced briefly at the contract still resting on the table, then back at Zoe. "Today, you kept me from walking through the wrong one," he said. Zoe looked up at him again, her expression steady, but there was something softer there now, something that had not been present when she first stepped into the room. "I just listened," she replied, her voice calm, as if the act itself had not felt extraordinary to her, only necessary. William studied her for a moment, then reached into his pocket, pulling out a simple business card, not with the intention of formality, but as a bridge between this moment and what came next. He hesitated briefly before handing it to her, not because he was unsure, but because he wanted the gesture to carry the right weight. "If you are willing," he said, his voice steady, "I would like to make sure you have every opportunity to keep doing what you just did, not just here, but anywhere it matters." Zoe looked at the card, then back at him, her brow furrowing slightly in thought, not overwhelmed, not dazzled, but considering the meaning behind the offer rather than the object itself. "You mean school?" she asked. William nodded once. "School, mentorship, anything you need to keep learning," he said, "because understanding like yours should not be limited by circumstance." Zoe held the card carefully, not gripping it tightly, but not letting it slip, her small fingers steady as she processed the moment, and after a brief pause, she gave a small, certain nod. "Okay," she said simply. The word was quiet, but it carried forward, not just an agreement, but the beginning of something that extended beyond the room, beyond the deal that had been stopped, into a future that had just opened in a way neither of them had planned, but both of them now understood mattered. The city outside had begun to shift into evening, the lights stretching longer across the glass buildings, turning sharp edges into something softer, and inside the conference room, that same quiet transformation lingered, not in the walls or the table or the empty chairs, but in the space between two people who had just changed the direction of something far larger than either of them had planned. William Ashford stood by the window now, looking out over Manhattan, his reflection faint against the skyline. And for once, he was not thinking about the next deal, the next number, or the next move. He was thinking about a moment that had interrupted all of that and forced him to see something he had almost missed. Behind him, Zoe remained near the table, the business card still held carefully in her hand, her fingers tracing its edge as if grounding herself in the reality of what had just been offered. The room was quiet, but it was no longer the kind of silence that follows tension. It was the kind that follows understanding. William turned back slowly, his gaze settling on her again, not as a passing presence, but as someone whose voice had already left a mark on everything he would do next. He said, his tone thoughtful, steady. In this building, people speak all the time. They present, they argue, they negotiate, but very few people actually say something that changes the outcome. Zoe looked up at him, her expression calm, not searching for praise, not expecting anything beyond the moment itself. I did not think about changing anything, she said simply. I just did not want you to make a mistake. William gave a small nod, accepting that, because it was exactly that absence of intention that had made what she did matter even more. He walked a few steps closer again, stopping at a distance that felt natural, not formal, not distant, just real. That is the difference, he said quietly. Most people in rooms like this are trying to gain something, but you are trying to protect something. The words settled gently, not heavy, not overwhelming, just clear. Zoe glanced down at the card again, then back at him, her brow lifting slightly. Does that happen a lot? She asked. William considered the question for a moment, then shook his head once. Not enough, he answered honestly. A faint hum from the city drifted through the glass, distant traffic, the rhythm of a world continuing forward. And for a moment, neither of them spoke, not because there was nothing to say, but because everything that mattered had already been said in simpler ways. Finally, William stepped back slightly, giving the space a sense of closure without ending. Someone will walk you downstairs, he said, his tone returning just enough to structure without losing warmth. And we will follow up on everything we discussed. Zoe nodded once, slipping the card carefully into the front pocket of her backpack. Not hurried, not careless, but intentional, as if she understood that what she carried now was not just paper, but possibility. She took a step toward the door, then paused, turning back just slightly. You listened, she said, her voice soft but certain. William met her gaze, a faint, genuine expression settling in his features, not formal, not distant, but real. You made it impossible not to, he replied. Zoe gave a small nod, then opened the door and stepped into the hallway, her figure quickly becoming part of the movement beyond, small, steady, and already blending back into a world that had no idea what she had just done. William remained where he was, the room now quiet again, but not empty, never empty in the same way, because something had shifted that would not return to what it had been before. He turned once more toward the city, the fading light reflecting across the glass. And for the first time in a long while, the decisions ahead of him felt different, not just calculated, but considered, not just strategic, but aware, and somewhere within that shift was a simple, undeniable truth that sometimes the most powerful voice in the room is the one no one expected to hear, until it is the only one that matters.